Hey Final Fantasy fans, this episode contains spoilers from the entire game of Final Fantasy XVI. And with that, welcome to the show.
But why did she exist, right? And why did she exist in these specific scenes? And why was she always interacting with dominance?
Hello everybody, welcome to the Final Fantasy Files, where we discuss all things Final Fantasy, from Phoenix Downs to Cura's. My name is Jolie Hales.
And I'm Ernest Dion.
And if you're wondering why we are talking about For Want of a Nail, you are not alone. Basically, when I asked Ernest which Final Fantasy XVI character he wanted to talk about first for these episodes, he surprised me by saying he wanted to talk about the girl who sells the potions. So that was kind of an unexpected choice for me to hear, but I'm going to go with it because Ernest, you are a deep thinker. Let's not kid ourselves.
Yeah, the reason I wanted to do this one is because Final Fantasy is one of those where, yes, sometimes you have some characters that didn't really have an impact to the storyline and could have gotten just, not mentioned at all. But generally, everything's there for a reason. And so this was the character that I think we saw multiple times, and it seemed like she had a very small role. But I think that there's actually a much bigger role for her than most people will realize. And obviously, at this point, the game's been out for a little bit. If you go look online, you'll see there's a whole bunch of random stuff about her. I think other people are catching on. But I kind of wanted to talk about that because I don't remember if it was Yoshi P or someone else on the team who said, pay attention to everything, even the smallest detail, because it'll matter, right? And that's kind of where this discussion came from.
That's fascinating. I love that because it's true. In Final Fantasy, one thing that separates the series apart from maybe other games is that they're extremely deliberate in everything in the story, which is really, really cool.
Yep.
It also gives you a lot to think about. And I should also say that Ernest is the one who came up with the title for this episode, For Want of a Nail, which makes me super curious because, Ernest, I know that that's a proverb,
yes,
right?
Yes, it's an ancient proverb. The origin of it is disputed, so I'm not going to even try to say where it came from.
So what is the proverb first? Maybe we start there.
So there's different versions of it, but the one that I hear the most goes like this. For want of a nail, the shoe was lost. For want of a shoe, the horse was lost. For want of a horse, the battle was lost. For the failure of battle, the kingdom was lost, right? So what the proverb is trying to say is that there are many things that happen in sequence and they happen for a reason. And in this case, a nail, right? The want of a nail ultimately resulted in a kingdom being lost.
Interesting.
So it's like the most insignificant thing you can think of in the right series of events can become a major boost or a major loss. In this case, it's a loss, right? Because the kingdom was lost.
So is it like from small and simple things, great things shall come to pass kind of a thing? Or is it
sort of, right?
Or completely destructive things can come to pass, but it all basically starts like maybe small things can change the future. Is that kind of what it's I know I'm simplifying it, but I'm not as familiar with this proverb as you are. And
no, that's the point of a proverb in general, right? It's like it can be interpreted multiple different ways, but those I think all apply here. And so again, this episode is going to be a little bit of a twist on that proverb when we get to the end, because the medicine girl sort of is the nail in the analogy, right?
Well, I'm looking forward to seeing where that goes. And for those who need a refresher on who the medicine girl is, so the girl who sells the potions, she shows up in Final Fantasy XVI only for kind of 5-ish times. That's it. And she does actually have a name, although I don't think we ever hear it in the game, and that's Kihel.
Right.
Is that how you say it? Kihel?
I would say Kihel, yeah.
And we really don't know much about her other than we know she's an orphan and we know that she survives by selling these restoratives and these curatives that she's made herself. And while she only shows up 4 or 5 times in the game, she interacts with all of the main characters almost like she kind of ties them together, which is really interesting. So let's talk about those 4 appearances in the game, or those 5-ish appearances. Oh, and I should say before we go any further that this episode, along with pretty much every episode of the Final Fantasy Files, we will be talking about a lot of spoilers. And if you're watching the video version, you'll be seeing a lot of spoilers. So you've been warned. Go ahead and play the game first. Come back for a discussion if you haven't done so already. There will be spoilers.
Absolutely.
Okay, so the first time that we see Kihel, she's referred to as the medicine girl if you're actually reading the subtitle text and you're looking at the names. And it's in the markets at Kostness, which is in the Dhalmekian Republic, which is Hugo Kupka's territory. And the first time we see her, it's right after that 5-year time jump after Sid dies. So the first crystal crumbles, Sid sadly passes away, and then we jump forward 5 years and we see Clive and Jill walking through this kind of market, and they're wearing hoods over their heads like they're trying to kind of disguise their identity at that point. And then Kihel notices Jill because she's there in the market trying to sell her curatives, right?
Might I interest you in a potion, milady? Perhaps a soothing salve to ease the aches of the road?
And Jill, who clearly has a soft spot for humanity, she actually pauses where most people in the market who hear Kihel don't. Jill pauses and she bends down to reveal her face to Kihel, while then apologizing that she isn't going to purchase a potion, basically. And then I don't even think Jill has finished her sentence when Kihel picks up on the fact that, oh, Jill's not going to buy anything. So she just mutters kind of a disappointed, like, may the mothers guide you. And then she abruptly moves on, shouting more of her selling kind of offerings to other passersby. And that's as simple as the interaction is, right? Clive and Jill then look at each other, and then they move on. And that's it for this first interaction with Kihel. And now that you mention it, I do think, because honestly, I didn't think a ton about the medicine girl before you and I talked, Ernest, but when I started kind of thinking about what this discussion would be about, this interaction kind of jumped out to me because, I mean, why does this scene exist?
That's the thing, yeah, because the scene's written in for a reason.
Right.
It's not just somebody saying, hey, go write a scene about this.
It's there for a purpose. So what is that purpose, right? And from a writing perspective, I would make this argument, and I'm sure you have some good interpretations about it, but for me, from a writing perspective, and I get kind of pragmatic and less philosophical, but it allows us to see Jill's personal care for those who have little, right? I mean, you could argue that that could be actually its complete purpose, because that in itself is enough reason to keep a scene like this in the game, but there are other ways that that could be shown, and why the exchange of looks afterwards between Jill and Clive, right? Is there more to the scene than just a simple passing by that justifies itself by showing Jill's care? Probably.
Yeah, so it's hard to say, but like you said, this is the first time we see her. So the first interaction we have with her, before we even get to the part of Jill noticing her, we hear her shouting in the background, right? What she's selling. Mm-hmm. It's calmatives, curatives, and restoratives.
Calmatives, this very morning. Restoratives, unguents, ointments, poultices.
Unguents,
Yeah.
ointments, and poultices.
There you go. So we don't know her yet, but she's this young girl, right? And as you said, she's an orphan. We find out later she's an orphan, right? Mm-hmm. So you have this little orphan girl who is, I guess you would consider a healer, kind of like Tarja, but just maybe not quite up to her level yet because she hasn't studied or anything like that. Mm-hmm. But she's somehow creating these apothecary things, right? And she's selling them to people. And it doesn't appear like it's snake oil. It's like she's actually selling something that should help people. But what caught my ear right away was the calmatives, curatives, and restoratives, right? So think about what that's entailing, right? So like the second half of it, where she talks about the other three, that's more about like healing physical wounds, right? Like ointments or poultices and whatever else she said. That's like you rub that on your skin. It's for like physical things. But if you're talking about a calmative, a curative, and a restorative, there's like a combination of things in there, right? So calmative, right, is to calm someone down.
Yeah.
So that's a mind thing or a spirit thing if you want to look at it like that, right?
Okay.
Curatives, right? So this is like a healing potion of some kind. And then a restorative, right? So it's restoring your health. And so the thing that came to mind when she said calmative, curative, restorative was immediately, it linked with like mind, body, and spirit. And like you said, when Jill kind of knelt down to talk to her, she realized right away that she wasn't going to buy them. And so she just like blew her off and walked away.
I'm sorry. I wish you well, but may the mothers guide you. Calmatives, curatives, restoratives.
I remember actually when I first played the game, I was like, oh, that girl's kind of a brat. Like, she actually gave me a negative impression of her. And then I thought, oh, you know what? It's an orphan girl trying to sell. Like, how harsh am I for disliking her?
Exactly, right.
But it initially annoyed me a little bit.
A little bit, right? But then, like, later on, once you understand what her backstory is and you think back to this, you're like, okay, you need to understand, like, this girl's an orphan, right? And she's selling these things to actually survive.
Exactly.
Right? So if somebody's not going to buy from her, she can't really be wasting her time.
She doesn't have survival.
Right. She needs to move on to somebody else who is going to buy it so that she can survive. So
it's a good mirror in front of your face for maybe judging somebody incorrectly. I think because I was annoyed or irritated. Later on, we have more interactions with her and they're very positive. And you realize, oh, given her circumstances, she actually could have been a lot bigger of a jerk than she was, to Jill, and she still would be forgiven for that, given what we know about her. So it's a good exercise in maybe don't judge a book by its cover, don't judge somebody on a first impression. You never know what's going on behind closed doors, which I thought was kind of interesting.
Exactly. And so the other thing I'll point out here, again, because this is in retrospect, right? Her first introduction into the story arc is interacting with two dominants, right? The dominant of fire and the dominant of ice. When fire and ice meet, you generally get something out of it.
Well, that's interesting because the name of the chapter in which we meet her in the second time is called Fire and Ice.
Surprise.
So yes, let's talk about that second time that we see Kihel. So the second time that we see her is right after the second crystal, Drake's breath, is destroyed. So again, right after a crystal goes down. And this is the crystal that the Iron Bloods had control over, if you remember. Joshua and Yote are traveling on the crystal road at this point, and you can see Twinside and Drake's tail, Mother Crystal, in the background behind them. And then Joshua has one of his coughing fits that he has throughout the game.
This way, Your Grace.
And then Yote helps him off the path to gather his strength. And our medicine girl, who is also apparently traveling this same path at the same time, she sees Joshua and she quickly approaches him, reaching into her bag for something to help him without even, I thought this was cool, without even stopping to ask for payment. And Joshua kindly stops her and tells her to save her potions, basically for someone who needs them most, because I think he knew full well that a potion wasn't going to solve the health issue that he was having in that moment, because he had this evil deity caged in his chest that probably can't be repaired by a potion. And that's the whole interaction. And then she just kindly, I think, leaves him alone at that point.
Absolutely. So she's running into another dominant now, right? Now it's the Phoenix, right? But you pointed out two key points. So she offers her medicines to Joshua without prompting for any kind of payment.
You're bleeding. I have a tonic which will...
I thank you for your kindness.
Now she's trying to be the kind person, right? Saying, oh, this person's clearly ill, right? He's coughing up blood or whatever. And like you said, Joshua says no.
Please, save your medicines for those who need them most.
And it's because they're moving in this caravan of people who are basically refugees at this point, right?
Yeah.
And so he knows that there's going to be other people in there that have issues physically, mentally, whatever the case is, and may need these. And he knows, as you said, that this is not going to help him. His problem is much deeper than that. So he says, no, keep them for somebody who needs them. And to me, that was a very good approach to writing that scene, because I can't count how many times I've been in a situation where something is being given away for free. You'll see people who will just go and take as much of it as they can, whether or not they need it or can even use it.
Yeah.
But then you have the people who are like, no, I don't want that, or I'll take one and let other people have the rest of them, right? So like this was kind of drawing the line there, showing like the difference between somebody who would just take anything they could and someone who was like, I know I can't use this.
Yes.
There are other people who need it. I'd rather they had it. So it kind of shows Joshua's soul a little bit, the kind of person he is.
Yes, just like how the first scene showed that for Jill.
Right, exactly. And then right after that scene, as you said, Yote takes him off to the side. He's kind of sitting there and Kihel has already walked away. Joshua looks at the people walking in this caravan and says, look at them all.
Look at them all. Like a river flowing to the sea.
Or moths to a flame, perhaps. The crystalline dominion, their light in the darkness.
So like they're setting up all of these things that have to do with the different elements that we see in the game. But it's interesting that the Phoenix is talking about water, right? People looking like water flowing to the sea. So now you have Kihel, who has interacted with 3 dominants in 2 scenes, right? 1 fire, 1 ice, 1 Phoenix. And again, the things she sells, right? Elementally based as well. So
interesting.
All of this is being woven together in here. And again, this is why I say like the smallest detail matters. And I feel like all of this ties together as we go further on and see her the next couple of times.
Okay, interesting. I didn't make the connection of the elements, but I'm going to pay closer attention to that as I think back to the next scenes. So the third time that we see Kihel is actually at Dion's camp, right? It's the camp of the Holy Order of the Knights Dragoon, right? So I think they're at war, and it's just after Clive takes out Drake's fang. So again, the next time we see her is after a crystal goes down. I actually didn't realize that until this moment as we're talking through. That is fascinating. Okay, so another crystal goes down, and it's Drake's fang, which is the Hugo Kupka crystal, right? Where Titan turns into stone and he becomes a torso and all that kind of thing. And then the time we see Kihel, she's trying to sell her restoratives to the dragoons who are walking around this camp until one of the dragoons basically threatens to hit her if she keeps trying to sell him stuff.
I have salves, potions, anything you need.
Stop bothering me, urchin, or you'll feel the back of my hand.
She then kind of looks down in sadness, and then we move on to the scene with Dion and Terence. And it's a really brief reaction. And it's interesting. A few things jumped out at me, and I'm sure you have some things to add. It's interesting that Dion has no idea that a young orphan who will later rescue him is in his very own camp, even being disrespected by those who serve him. And Kihel, again, from a writing perspective, is a perfect opportunity to draw out the real inner soul of the people she talks to. So in the first scene, Jill is kind to her when no one else is, even reveals her face to her. In the second scene, Joshua is kind to her and tells her to save her potions for people who need the most. And he's thinking about other people. In this scene, it's a random dragoon, not one of our heroes, and he's just a jerk to her. And this is supposed to be the Holy Order of the Knights Dragoon. This guy's supposed to be like cream of the crop in the Empire, fighting alongside the icon of light, right? And he's just a jerk. And by interacting with her, it really reveals who he is inside.
Yeah, that's exactly it. But she's now in the vicinity of yet another dominant, right? Now she's got a fourth dominant she's around. And I think, like you said, this drew like the juxtaposition between the dragoon who just didn't want to even acknowledge her existence versus Dion. And of course, the kind of person he is. And then in this scene, Dion has been out. He's back and he's obviously wounded or has issues of some kind. So it's actually Terence that patches him up. And then right at the tail end of the scene, that's when Joshua and Yote walk in. So now you're seeing again an interaction of multiple dominants in the same place. And this piece is called Into the Darkness. So it's an interesting juxtaposition that you're actually going into the crystalline dominion, the dominion of light with the dominant of light, but it's talking about going into the darkness as opposed to into the light. So she seems to be part of this theme happening of like opposite elements in all kinds of different scenarios.
Interesting.
I think something to call out is in this case, you have the dominant of light and the Phoenix, who theoretically are supposed to be like two positive dominants or two positive forces in the same place at the same time. This is where they end up having the discussion about Ultima, what goes on. But again, the medicine girl is part of this very key scene where these two dominants are talking about these big things, right? So why is she in Dion's camp? Why is she here again? I mean, I'm assuming she kept moving with that caravan, right, that Joshua was in, but it's just her uncanny ability to be around these dominants all the time. Whenever she appears, it's just interesting.
Right. When she's not even intending to do it herself. It's where the winds kind of take her.
Right. That's, I think, the end of that scene.
So then the fourth time that we see her, and you could actually argue the fourth and the fifth time that we see Kihel, this medicine girl, is actually a scene that opens up after Drake's tail, Mother Crystal, which is the twin side Mother Crystal, goes down. So a little bit of time goes by. It's not immediately after, but it's in the rubble and the aftermath of that crystal tumbling. And the scene actually opens up with Dion, who is clearly injured, who clearly left Taya's care before his body was completely healed. We see him basically struggling to walk through this rubble of Twinside, surveying the wreckage of the city that he was responsible for destroying after he had lost control of his icon Bahamut. So really interesting ideas and scenes that happened in that sequence of events. And Dion then, in the rubble, he collapses. And he collapses, I would argue, not only under the physical duress that his body is going through, but under the heaviness of knowing that he was the cause of the devastation combined with his injured state.
Right. Mental stress and physical stress.
Totally. And then Kihel, who is in the same rubble at the exact same time, she's actually assisting another man when she sees Dion. And instantly, when she sees Dion collapse, she runs over to him. And then that scene ends. And then a bit later, this is the 5th time we see her, but it's part of the same sequence of events. Dion then wakes up in a home that is clearly in the slums somewhere in Twinside. And he's bandaged, he's laying in this bed, and he looks around and he really doesn't know where he is. And then Kihel walks in to that house and she finds him to be awake. And you can tell that she's happy to see that he's all right. And at that point, Dion processes the scene around him. I thought one shot was really interesting to me when he looks over and he sees his royal spear laying up against this background of this impoverished slum home. And it's like this intricately designed royal spear juxtaposed against something that is completely not intricate and not royally designed. And I think that's kind of a realization of where he is and what that means, and really makes him kind of think. And then Kihel at that point offers him some water, and Dion sits, and basically he just takes a lot of time to process everything in his mind. And you can see that he's thinking a lot about the events that have happened, where he is now, and probably the future. And then we hear Kihel explain the significance of the floating lanterns.
Grandmother told me spirits sometimes get lost, and that the lanterns guide them to their proper place. I set one on the river for her when she passed away.
Which probably also just adds to the anguish that Dion's feeling, because all of those lanterns is another tally that he probably feels personal responsibility for. And this is when Dion, I think, decides that he must atone for what he's done.
This is my doing, my fault, my sin to bear. And for it, I must atone.
And I think this is where he decides to live only so that he can die at the right moment of sacrifice in order to make things right, his atonement. And then Kihel says that it was her poultices, apparently, that healed him. And then she explains that she makes and sells these restoratives in order to keep bread on her table. So we learn more about her. And then Dion apologizing for not having anything to give her. She's pretty much fine with that, knowing that she couldn't leave an injured man on the road, even with no chance of reward. And at no point in this scene does she say anything about him being the royal prince, which it must be obvious that he's someone important, if not completely obvious who he is in general. And she doesn't seem to care about that. The thing that makes her happy is just knowing that he has been healed, that a man in her care has been healed. And the last line of the scene is when Kihel asks Dion,
"Will you promise to come back and visit?"
And it's interesting because she asks the question and the scene fades to black before we get any answer, which is indicative that he knows that he's not going to be able to do that. Because I think at this point, Dion knows that he's not going to live much longer. And I thought that was a really nice touch.
Yeah, it fades to black. So the assumption is that he doesn't promise her. But yes, that ending leaves us a little bit on a cliffhanger. Again, here she is by herself with a dominant. So I want to rewind to the beginning of the scene. She's helping another man, and then she notices that Dion collapses. Then the next scene, he's in her slum, and he's laying there. So the immediate thing that came to my mind was, how on earth did she get him in there? How did she carry him, or did she get someone else to help? I mean, he's obviously a big individual, right?
Right.
And she's a little girl.
See, again, being pragmatic, I assumed that she probably got the assistance of other people.
Probably, right? But who knows, right? But all we know is that he ended up in her little slum house. So if she did get someone to help her, why did he end up there? Why didn't he end up back at the camp or somewhere else, right? So I thought that was interesting. The other thing that I'll call out here with respect to that part of the scene is that she's helping one person and then like abandons them to go help him, right? So that could just be her innate sense saying like, hey, this guy over here is hurt, but he's clearly conscious, fine, probably not going to die. This one over here that just collapsed, who knows? He might need more help. So she brings him into her little abode. And the immediate thing that came to mind when I saw him wake up in there was it reminded me of Final Fantasy VII.
Which part?
And it reminded me of it because you had the crystalline dominion, right? With all this money. And so it reminded me of like the upper level versus the lower level in the slums, right? And kind of the disparity in terms of wealth and power and all that kind of stuff. And here's a guy who is used to living his entire life in wealth and privilege, essentially being saved by
someone from Sector 7.
An orphan, exactly, living in the slums. And then he wakes up, he's completely bandaged. But when she sees him awake, she immediately runs out, comes back in, and says, "Here, I got water."
Here, it's fresh from the well.
Now, I just watched this entire place get lit up by Bahamut, right? So I'm like, how is this well still functioning, or what's going on here? So, but again, we see like another element introduced into the story here, right? Which is water. Like you have the light, you have water, you have darkness, you have the slum. And then you talked about the lanterns, right? And so he's looking at this, right? And like you said, he's taking a physical tally of some of the destruction he's caused, right? Just some of it, not even all of it. And she says, "Grandma said sometimes spirits get lost and the lanterns lead them back to where they should be." You're seeing this juxtaposition of like wealth and privilege and then the slum. And the reason he went crazy is because of his grievance with his father, who was no longer acting in the best interest of the kingdom and of its residents, and instead of himself and his lineage. So Dion knows what the right thing to do is, but he's clearly drifted, right? Now, internally he has it correctly, but his father and his family have drifted from what they should be doing. And so her words are kind of indicating like things got off track, but the light will take you back to where you need to be.
Interesting.
Right. And I think that's where all this stuff is kind of congealing in his mind, where he realizes that atonement is ultimately what's going to free him from all of this. And then the callback again to Final Fantasy VII, if you think about it, is the whole reason that this dichotomy of society existed was because the Shinra Corporation was essentially pumping the Mako out of the earth and was going to result in like
destroying the earth.
It's so similar to the mother crystals and the blight.
And how they take all the ether.
Right. And so this is again why I say like her story is just so interesting, because she's woven into these key moments, right? So just an interesting place for Kihel to be. And I think that's essentially the last time we see her.
That's the last time we see her, but that's not her last moment in the story. We hear about her again, not too long afterwards, and that happens when Dion meets up with Uncle Byron, and then he helps basically take out the Akashic in that kind of funny scene.
And you would fight alongside us? I owe the Phoenix a debt.
Terence is there, and Dion speaks to Terence for the last time, giving Terence a bag that we can assume is probably filled with money with Gil. And Dion instructs Terence to see that the girl who helped him is taken care of. And it's actually a super sad scene on second playthrough. So it's sad on first playthrough, but when you realize that that's an eternal goodbye to Terence, because, you know, Terence and Dion are lovers, right? It's so sad. You feel so bad for both Terence and Dion because you know what happens to Dion.
Farewell, my prince.
And Dion has basically, at this point, he's been nursed back to health so that he can atone for his sins with his life. And he knows he's going to die, I would argue. And I would also argue that at this point, Terence knows it. And it's devastating to poor Terence. And that's why, because the first time I watched it, I was like, well, just go help the girl and then come back and talk to Dion. I didn't quite catch on. Second time, I was like, oh,
yeah,
Terence knows what this means. Terence knows his prince well enough to know that this is a goodbye forever. And then I would say that we can only assume at that point that Terence made good on his promise and he found Kihel and saw that she was taken care of.
Yeah, and that's exactly what I suspect happened, right?
Yeah.
And so this is another one where you try to figure out, why was this written in? Like, it's obvious that she saved his life, right? We know that. Dion's, I should say. But why was the scene written in where two seemingly unrelated things happen at the same time, which is Dion essentially has his final farewell with his lover, but at the same time gives him a task to do that is like on the surface menial.
Know that I do not ask this lightly.
He's giving him this like bag of money. But I remember another scene where Uncle Byron was walking around and he pulled a sack about the same size out of his pants or whatever. to give to somebody.
It was the boat driver, I think, wasn't it?
Right.
The
Somebody.
ferry person.
For your trouble.
It was a pleasure, in hindsight.
And he freaks out like he's giving him $1 billion or something, right? So I can only assume that Dion, who is of even more wealth, having that sack probably was multiple lifespans worth of money in like one sack, right?
Right.
But he hands that over to Terence and says, take care of her.
You are to see that she is provided for.
And so it's not just a final goodbye. He's giving him a final charge, right? So like Terence's job up until that point, aside from being Dion's lover, was he was one of his dragoons. He was supposed to defend him and actually give his life for him. And instead, Dion is now releasing him from that charge.
That's so true. And that's so sad. Oh my gosh.
The writers, I tell you, they're on another level.
You're right. He's asking him to do the opposite
Yeah.
of what the intention always was.
And to make sure that she's taken care of, right? That's the important part. And then we don't hear from her again or about her again. We don't see her again, right? That's kind of the end of it. So like you said, we assume that he finds her, that he makes good on it. We don't know exactly what happens there, but that's the end of her story arc, right? So
right. And then, since that's the last time we see or hear about Kihel, basically, we as the gamer is left to wonder, is she still alive? Right. And this is a good question to think about because Kihel lived in the Twinside slums, right? And while she survived Bahamut's crazy, like, wrath fest across the city, this massive city, that wasn't the last tragedy to befall Twinside, if you remember. Ultima literally uproots a crystal from beneath Twinside and destroys whatever is left of this city, right? It just poof, goes up into dust, basically. And that includes what appears to be its slums because it's very far-reaching when that happens. So one could conclude that everyone there would have probably perished along with the city. So then we're left to wonder if Terence made good on his promise to Dion, right, before that happened, and whether or not that promise involved removing Kihel from Twinside and maybe relocating her somewhere else altogether. And since I would say that the first is quite likely, I think Terence is clearly loyal and loves Dion. I see no reason why he would not fulfill his promise. It's really the second question that we need to answer, like, did he relocate her? And it's hard to know, but I would say probably did, because Twinside is technically still the capital of the Empire before it's uprooted by Ultima or whatever. And it's probably still technically home of the Dragoons, though I would imagine they probably are living in a camp or something at this point or just dispersed.
Right.
Because the government at this point is basically crumbled. So where else would Terence have to go? And that said, if he were looking to take care of this girl, he probably wouldn't house her in a crumbled castle, right? Or a crumbled city. So I would make the argument that he moved her to a different location altogether, meaning that she is still alive. And then there's a cheater way that I believe that she's still alive as well. Right before Clive, Joshua, and Dion actually left for that final Ultima battle, I actually checked Vivian's cast sheet, and Kihel was listed as being alive. And so then I wondered, well, are the characters who die marked dead right away on Vivian's records if maybe only Clive knows that they're dead? Or is it whether Clive and us know or not, they're marked dead as they die on that sheet? So I tested that theory as well. So on my second playthrough, I actually skipped all the side quests in the game. And when I checked Vivian's sheet before the final battle, Theo, do you remember Theo of the Crimson Caravans? Theo was marked dead, even though I had never played the side quest where he died. So he was marked dead on Vivian's sheet, but Clive didn't know he was dead. So if that rule proves consistent, as I would argue it would be, I would say that the fact that Kihel is marked alive before that final battle means that she survived. So I would say yes, Kihel is alive. She did not stay in Twinside. I have no idea where she is, but she's alive.
Yeah, so I agree. I also think she's alive. And I didn't go look at Vivian's thing to verify or whatever, but instead I tried to look at it from the other side, which is she was definitely a minor character, at least in the grand scheme of things, right? Like to where no one really knew her by name, right, in the story. But my thought was, okay, so if Terence got to her, I don't think Terence's first action would be like, hey, I've got $1 billion in this sack. Let's go ahead and hang out here in the slum forever.
Right.
Right.
And he also wouldn't just drop off the bag of money and be
Right,
like,
and then
hey,
leave her.
Dion wanted you to have this.
Right.
Bye. Right. That's not Terrence's way. Terrence is somebody who's going to really
Right.
be true to his promise, and he's going to make sure she's taken care of.
Exactly. So my guess is like yours, that he got her and took her somewhere safe.
Maybe even adopted her. I mean, that's how loyal
Or adopted her.
Terrence was.
Now, what I was looking for, going back and researching this, was did they end up at the hideaway?
Uh-huh.
Even before the
Yeah.
final fight,
When they have that big send-off.
they're not there.
Everyone's there, even people who haven't been to
Right.
the hideaway before,
Exactly.
you know, from various side quests. They're all there. So if she was going to be at the hideaway, she would have likely appeared in that scene.
She would have been in that scene somewhere, right?
Yep.
So the fact that she wasn't there, right, tells me that, okay, she probably went somewhere else. Where would she go? I have no idea. But I will point out one thing that I know I pointed out to you earlier. Terrence is a dragoon, right? So worst case scenario, they're somewhere in the vicinity of this thing when it pops off. Dragoons can't die from fall damage. That's one of their attributes.
Oh, you're not going to... Okay.
So he could have easily grabbed her and jumped, right? And survived, ran off, whatever. So,
But I think it's like a puff of dust. Like,
Right.
I don't even think a dragoon would... I don't think it's about surviving the fall off of the lifted island. I think it's like, poof,
Yeah,
everything's
well,
destroyed.
there's that too, right? So I do think they survived, but for different reasons. But why would you write her into this story only to have her die in that kind of insignificant, terrible...
Right.
I would think you wouldn't do that as a writer. So then if I assume she lives, right, then I want to know, like, what happened after that? So you have the final send-off, you have the fight with Ultima, it ends, you know, you have the after credits footage and all that kind of stuff. Nowhere does she pop up in any of this stuff. So what's the continuation of the story here? What happened? So I'll start with the proverb here, for want of a nail.
Okay. Yeah, I'm curious how that comes back around.
Right. And the way the proverb was written, it's to say that for want of something insignificant, a nail, right, the kingdom was lost. I think Kihel actually plays the inverse of this proverb in this story, which is she plays one of the most key roles, as far as I'm concerned, in this game. And here's why. The things that happened that led her up to that moment where she saved Dion's life were, you could say, chance. I don't believe in chance. I think they happened that way for a reason. So she ends up saving his life. Now think about it this way. Dion's the one that got them into Origin, right? So now...
Oh, I see where you're going with this. Oh.
So Dion is the one that got them into Origin because Joshua was already in super poor health. And sure, he could have turned into the Phoenix and flown Clive in there, but at what cost, right? Remember that Bahamut typically, not in every single Final Fantasy, but typically is like the most powerful of the summons, or in this case, icons or whatever, right? So
Almost always.
if she had not saved him, he wouldn't have been there to get them into Origin. But even more than that, every time it was 2 versus 1 against Ultima, the first couple of times they just got
destroyed.
Even with 3-on-1, it was too much. They couldn't do it, right? So what ended up happening here was Dion's sacrifice, if that's what you believe, was what opened the door that allowed ultimately Clive with Joshua's power to end the story.
To save the world.
So if Dion hadn't been able to do that, hadn't been able to sacrifice himself, hadn't been able to atone for what he did, then we probably would have had a different outcome.
So you would argue that he could have died there in the rubble.
He could have died in the rubble from his wounds.
So he doesn't die, and not only is he physically saved, but it's in her home that he realizes the sacrifice he has to make and then makes that determination. And because all of that happened, which was due to Kihel's kindness and curatives, that's why the world was saved. So for want of a small medicine girl, an entire world was saved. Ernest,
That's right.
I get it. That is so interesting.
It's
I
amazing,
love it.
right? The writers did a phenomenal job. With Kihel, yes, you could have just extracted her from the story entirely, right? And it could have been written completely differently. But why did she exist, right? And why did she exist in these specific scenes? And why was she always interacting with dominance throughout this entire fiasco? She could have appeared just interacting with normal people, right, throughout the entire story. But it's always after a crystal falls, always in the vicinity of a dominant.
Yeah.
And then the last time we see her is obviously after a crystal falls, but then preceding like the fall of the final crystal, right? So
Yeah.
It's kind of like she has a purpose here and she's tying all of this stuff together.
Yes. And she does it in a very unique way, a way that even the characters themselves are completely unaware of.
Right.
Right. Never do any of these characters realize or discuss in any way that they've all interacted with this same girl. And yet we know, right? We, the gamer, the person who's watching the story unfolds, we know that she's this other connection amongst so many connections between these characters. And I think that's really good, really interesting writing. And I also like that she draws out the true inner qualities from every character she interacts with. So in the case of our heroes, she draws out like compassion and humanity for those who have less than she does, right? Jill shows it by stopping to face her when she's trying to hide her identity, but she literally takes off her hood and faces her in this busy market where it's dangerous for her even to be seen.
Right.
Joshua shows it by encouraging her not to waste a potion that could help somebody else, let alone waste the income that maybe she would make from selling that potion to help herself, right? And then Dion shows it by sending the man he cares for the most to see that she's taken care of entirely. So whereas conversely, so many other people around her just ignore her, we see her in busy markets, nobody pays attention to her, which reveals, you know, their potential lack of humanity or
loss of it, right? Like a lot of people are in like a depressive or desperate situation.
Right, because a lot of them are refugees.
Right.
But it really shows our heroes for being who they are. They're not just heroes on the outside. They're not just heroes because they have icon powers, right? They're heroes on the inside. And then if you go back to the camp and the dragoons, right? That dragoon who's supposed to be this elite warrior who serves the people of the empire treats her like total garbage, which is showing his like inner soul, his inner person. And in that way, I think one of our purposes in the game is to further separate these heroes from those who are not real heroes, while also making us reflect on how maybe we would interact with somebody like her should we ever encounter somebody like that face to face, which we probably do all the time in reality.
Exactly. And so one of the things I'll call out here, you know, kind of going back to the interacting with the dominance and the kind of interaction of the elements. So there are 3 that she specifically doesn't interact with in this story, right? Garuda, wind, stone, and Odin, darkness, right? So those 3 she doesn't interact with at all in any way. And they are also typically, again, in Final Fantasy lore, they kind of have negative perceptions.
Yeah, they're like the destructive icons, right?
The destructive ones.
Garuda is usually some slutty dressed, like psycho laughing, doesn't care. Yeah, exactly. And Titan's usually just this destructive power that's the size of a mountain. And Odin is darkness, and darkness is not associated with goodness.
Exactly. So those were like the counterbalance to the other elements, right? Now I want to tie it back to another thing. So, you know, there's the blight. And when Ultima's dying at the end, he's asking Clive, like, what do you think is going to happen now? And Clive is like, I don't know.
What do you imagine will befall this world now that you have gained your precious freedom?
I honestly don't know. But I doubt it will be pretty. A sorry tale of sin and suffering, hardship and pain.
And it was for this that you fought so fiercely?
Basically saying, like, you know, congratulations, you've essentially killed the Earth.
My congratulations. Relish this victory, knowing that you have but delayed the inevitable. Your world is already dead. May you enjoy an eternity on its blackened husk.
But the thing that comes back to mind is that imagine we're fast forwarding, like at the end of the game, we're in the middle of the credits somewhere. So it's after the fight with Ultima and all that has finished, but before the credit scenes where the little kids are playing. In the middle of there's a massive gap in time, right? Like hundreds, perhaps thousands of years. Something has to change, right? When we get the post-credit scene, obviously the world is not a husk. Life goes on. So I think of it as like, okay, the blight was going to consume the entire world, right? But it didn't. So something changed that caused it to either go away or stop or whatever the case is, right? And so I'm looking back at the elements of this, right? So the blight it killed things, right? It sapped all of the ether out of the ground so plants couldn't grow. And so the thing that would make life progress, or if you think about the history of Earth in terms of like, how did life initially start on the planet, right? It was born of water. That's how it all started.
Like our life, not theirs.
Human life, right? But life in general, most scientists believe that life cannot exist without water. So the blight is taking everything away. The only thing that would be able to fight the blight and return anything back would have to be water, right? You would need water to be able to do that. And the blight had actually poisoned the water that was around the hideaway. Remember on one of the side quests, we had to go get some kind of goop to put on the hull of the boat?
Oh, yeah, the pitch.
Because the blight water was eating the hull of the guy's boat.
Yeah.
And so I'm trying to figure out, like, how do we get to the end state, right? And so one of the things I found in doing some research, it was a research paper that said, water has tremendous healing potential for the human mind, the body, and the spirit. Water can physiologically and psychologically benefit people because of its therapeutic nature. Since those ancient times, water has been one of the most effective elements in combating illness and injury.
Do you think that Kihel is the not yet primed dominant of Leviathan?
So when I go back and look at her calmatives, curatives, and restoratives, all water-based, all healing mind, body, and spirit, they would have the ability at scale to heal a planet that was afflicted with a blight.
Okay.
So if you had just like kind of the skill set or innate ability to heal, which it seems like Kihel does, right? That's why she's making these things. And you could scale it to planetary scale. You could, in theory, fight back a blight and actually get rid of it. But you would need an immense amount of hydropower to do that. So
is she Leviathan the Lost?
There's only one dominant that's missing in this story.
Oh my gosh, you really think she's that?
And so I think she has, I don't know whether she's Leviathan's dominant, but I think she has something to do with that dominant.
That is, okay, mind equals blown. Because they do talk about, I did not think any of this, by the way. So this is all new thoughts for me. But they do throughout the game talk about how Leviathan did exist, right? He's Leviathan the Lost.
Right.
He just hasn't revealed himself. He hasn't had a dominant for a long time. I don't know if they specify exactly how long, but it's been so long.
Right.
Leviathan the Lost is on the mural, right? And Joshua mentions him when he looks at the mural, or her, who knows.
Even Leviathan the Lost is here.
So, wow. That is like so deep. Ernest.
You have to reach, right? Because this is what these writers are doing. Now, I could be completely wrong, right? I could just made all this up in my mind.
So the only thing, so I hate to even, bring us down here or nix this, but the only thing is that dominance, we can assume, ceased to exist once the crystal is destroyed by Clive, right? Because magic is gone from the earth. That was said in his little speech before he does it.
And see Ultima's legacy. Bearers, dominance, crystals, magic, consigned to the flames.
And I think that final little fireball that he casts is like, it doesn't last for very long. It just snuffs out. So I think the idea is that dominance, magic, all of the icon stuff ceases to exist at that point. So then Leviathan would continue to be lost and never reveal himself, right?
And that's possible too, right? That's another interpretation, right? That all of that ceased to exist.
It's kind of a letdown because I like the Leviathan idea.
Does it go away immediately or does it take time?
Yeah.
To kind of dwindle and eventually go away?
I assumed that Clive's sacrifice was the point that the earth could start to heal because the magic was no longer sucking the ether out of the world. That's how I took it.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that that's accurate because we have no idea in that credits time jump.
Right. They don't tell us anything.
Which kind of is one of my issues with the ending, to be honest. But you're right. It could go a few different ways.
Yeah. They did it on purpose, right? To kind of leave it open to interpretation where everybody could have their own opinion of what happened there in the end, and which is okay.
No, it's not. Not for me.
Personally, I don't like that kind of a thing, but the writers have done a phenomenal job with this.
The writers did such an amazing job. Even if you don't like the ending or you don't like parts of the ending, you can't dismiss the amazing talent that went into the bulk of this game.
Right.
Up until that point, at least, right? And some people do really love the ending. They would stand by the writers the entire way through.
Absolutely.
So interesting.
Yeah.
That's fascinating.
Who knows? But again, at the end of the day, my whole thing here is that this girl existed because she was going to be the thing that ultimately allowed Dion to do what he needed to do to get Joshua and Clive to do what they needed to do to finally put an end to this thing.
And that's interesting because she was a simple medicine girl, which I think is also empowering for the average person like us.
Yeah, there's plenty of discussion about like she represented humanity, like just pure and raw humanity, right? That's what she was. Not only in herself, but just in the interactions with her from other people. You saw different aspects of humanity. And I agree with all of that.
Yeah.
So there it is, For Want of a Nail, right?
That's crazy.
It was just amazing that such a, on the surface, insignificant character turned out to be a linchpin of this story.
Indeed. That is amazing.
It was my poultices that saw you well.
You make them?
And sell them, or try to. Earns me enough for bread, most days.
Forgive me. I have nothing to...
I know, but I couldn't just leave you lying there.
That's going to do it for this episode of the Final Fantasy Files. And man, I didn't think we'd go that deep into a character we see for maybe, 5 minutes, if that, total.
If that. So can you imagine what's going to happen when we talk about Annabella or Dion?
Oh
or any
my
of these
gosh.
others?
I got lots of B-roll to pull.
Oh, yeah.
Will you promise to come back and visit?
Thank you so much for joining us. If you enjoyed what you heard, you can subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts, including on YouTube, where you can see the video version and you can see a lot of these clips as we're talking about them.
And if you really enjoy this, please leave a review on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify Podcasts, whatever podcast place you go. We would appreciate it. Tell your friends about us. If they are also fans of JRPGs and Final Fantasy, we'd love to have more people listening to the show.
And leave a comment. I've done some reviews in Final Fantasy in the past and I got hundreds of comments that were so interesting. The Final Fantasy community has such interesting insights. Please bring that to this podcast. We'd love to read your comments on the air, maybe discuss them. Just love that interaction with fellow fans like us. And with that, walk tall, my friends.
And may the Firebird's flame burn forever in your hearts.
Yes.
Jeez, that's so bad.
So bad. I love it.
God, I can already see the eye rolls.
And it's said by like the weirdest people in the game. And that's your slogan now. You have to use it.